I'm Lisa Rothman. I'm the Executive Vice President of NCJW, and welcoming you all today to hear our talk on our annual Sharon Carmel Hadassah joint meeting book review with NCJW. I represent NCJW, and most of you know that NCJW is very active in the Long Beach area. We are the Greater Long Beach and West Orange County section of a national organization that represents progressive views, progressive action, advocacy for needs of women and children. And at this time, nothing could be more needy than looking at reproductive justice. And we're having a lot of programs with Planned Parenthood and community service events in the next year. And we hope that many of you will get charged up to be involved. I just came back from the Long Beach Women's March and heard many speakers, city council women and people like Katie Porter and Councilman Garcia promoting the needs of women and the needs of empowerment of women. Even it's inspiring to see people joining together to say Roe v. Wade being overturned really made a difference. It made a difference in our awareness. And as Gloria Allred said, we have to be mad as hell or we won't take it anymore, and we won't take it anymore. And we have kind of gotten a little bit too complacent, maybe. NCJW is never complacent, and that's why I'm involved with NCJW. I'm going to turn it over to the person who will be introducing our speaker, Laura Kaplan. Our introducer is one of our esteemed members, the Honorable Sherry Sobel, who has been Vice President of Advocacy in the past and Executive Vice President at NCJW, and what we call a woman of valor. We designated her our awardee in the last couple of years with the Jewish Federation, and we're very proud of her because she's always represented women and children in everything that she does and has done in juvenile court. So I will turn it over to Sherry Sobel.
Wow. Thank you, Lisa. That was absolutely lovely. I agree that we cannot have a topic that is more today than this topic, and we're absolutely thrilled to have Laura with us. You know, I'm not big on what school did you go to, what did you do when you were 37 years old. That doesn't interest me. I always start with a quote, and I'm going to start with this one today. This was in the comic section of the LA Times yesterday, under Mutz. Through developing an attitude of responsibility toward others, we can begin to create the kinder, more compassionate world we all dream of. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. This was in a cartoon. I cut it out and I'm going to keep it. We couldn't have a better speaker. There's going to be mystery, and there's going to be a lot of information about a time when women were, in my opinion, at their bravest. And we will be learning some fabulous lessons. Laura's going to start out by giving us a little background about how she got involved. And then from there on in, I'll ask some questions, and then we'll open it up for your questions. But take it away, Laura Kaplan. We're thrilled to have you here from Upper New York State.
Thank you so much. And it's great to be here. I hope everybody can hear me. Yes, I am. Have a pretty loud voice for a very small person. So my name is Laura Kaplan, and I'm the author of a book called The Story of Jane, and I'll pick it up and show it to you. And thank you. Other people have it as well. And I'm going to start out by just telling you a little bit about myself, how I got involved. So Jane was the code name for a group officially known as the Abortion Counseling Service of Women's Liberation in Chicago. The group started in 1969 I had been a student in Chicago and graduated in 69. And I moved back to Chicago in the fall of 1971. And right after I moved back, my very dear friend Alice, who's still a good friend of mine, we went to college together, discovered she was pregnant. It turned out that she'd had an IUD inserted in and it was inserted incorrectly. But in any case, here she was pregnant. Abortion was illegal in Illinois. And so she looked around and she saw an ad in an underground paper. She doesn't remember which one, but if any of you remember the early 70s and late 60s, there were a lot of underground newspapers around. And so the ad said something like, pregnant, don't want to be, call Jane, and with our phone numbers. So she did. I have to say at this point, so this is September of 1971, she could have, and she was from New York, she could have gotten on a plane and flown to New York and gotten a legal abortion there because New York legalized abortion in the summer of 1970. But she chose not to. She was going to take care of it herself. I don't know what she was thinking, but in any case, she called Jane. She went through the experience, and afterwards she came to my apartment, and she was so excited and thrilled by this experience, not only that she was no longer pregnant, but the experience itself was so exciting to her that she was almost bouncing off the walls of my apartment. And I, who was 24 years old, had been wanting to get involved in the women's liberation movement. I wasn't thinking abortion because I just come from New York where it was legal, so it wasn't uppermost in my mind, but her description of what she had just experienced made me think, that sounds pretty cool. So she took me to meet her counselor who lived in my neighborhood, who told me that they were going to start a session, new counselor training sessions, and I could come. So I went. And as I often say, so the rest is my history. I got very engrossed and very involved in the service, which is what we internally, how we internally referred to ourselves. To the outside world, we were known as Jane. It pretty much took over my whole life until from the fall of 71 until we folded a few months after Roe v. Wade was decided in January of 1973, when the first legal clinics opened. So we started as, like many groups around the country, and some of you might have even been involved in these groups, abortion counseling and referral service. That's what we initially did. We sussed out the underground providers, found the most competent ones, helped women because illegal abortions were extremely expensive, raise money. So we raised money to lend to women, always with the understanding that, we hope you pay us back because then we can lend money to another woman. And we, in advance of the abortion, we counseled women, explained everything we could about what they were going to go through. So that's how the group started. But the very inner circle of the group very quickly realized that sending women off someplace and saying, everybody's come back alive was not much of a marketing, we weren't really doing much. And they figured out pretty quickly that the only way to give women power over this experience was if we controlled it ourselves. And so that original group, and before my time, looked for people they could control who were providing good abortions. And they found somebody. Over the course of the next year and a half, the women in the group got to actually sit in during the abortions. And eventually, it was revealed. And I always do this in the passive tense because nobody remembers exactly how it went down. I have my suspicions, which I'll tell you. It was revealed to the group at large that our guy, our doctor, was not in fact a doctor. And this was a huge crisis. Women in the group were crying and saying, we have to fold. We're just like the back alleys. But calmer heads prevailed, you know, and said things like, well, who did you think would be working this closely with us? You know, did you really think a doctor would do this? And in fact, during that meeting, one woman said, well, if he can do it and he's not a doctor, then we could do it too, and we could charge a whole lot less. And my feeling is that it was revealed to the group because one woman was already learning to do abortions, and she knew that for the group to accept that she, and by extension, we could do this, that they would first have to accept that our guy, whose name is Mike, was not in fact a doctor. So people left the group at that point, but the people who stayed were committed. And over the course of a few months, when she was fully trained, he trained a few other women in the group, and she then trained women in the group, and we became a completely woman-run underground abortion service. We charged at that point when it was just us, because he was in it for the money. We were in it for the women being able to determine their own futures. So we lowered the price to $100 or what you could afford, and lots of women paid nothing, and some women paid $5, $20, whatever they had. Completely woman run. And when we folded, we estimate that we were responsible for over 11,000 illegal, safe, low-cost abortions for women in the city of Chicago, the suburbs, and out of town who heard about Jane and came to Chicago to find us. So that is just about the 15 minutes I was given. Let me just say, I decided to write the book in the 80s because I thought I had been a community organizer for all of my life from that point on. And I thought, well, this is a really exciting story. It's kind of a political adventure story. And it's a good way to tell some lessons about community organizing. And so I thought about it in that way when I was writing it. And I really didn't want an outsider to be the one to write about us, because people look at us and think we were, oh, so courageous, oh, so brave. None of that is true. We were ordinary women who found ourselves in a situation and were able to, and chose to do it, and were able to accomplish something pretty extraordinary. Because we were doing D&Cs, so we were doing surgery. There weren't medical abortions then. But we were not particularly, I don't think we were particularly brave. When I look at our similarities, I think we were a very intelligent group of women, but we were very controlling and we were very arrogant, and we were kids. We were all in our 20s, so we were kind of stupid, to think we could get away with this, and we pretty much did. So we were extremely lucky. So that's in a nutshell the very abbreviated version of the story of Jane. So I wanted young people especially to read the story and think, oh, that could be me. And not think, oh, that's some heroic figure I could never measure up. I think that's the downside of painting people as heroes or brave or courageous, is it allows others to then say, well, that wouldn't be me. I'm not that person. But none of us were that person. We were just people who thought, gee, this is something good I could do with my time. None of us in the beginning knew how things would evolve. So it wasn't like anybody thought, oh, yeah, I'm going to do illegal abortions. It was just, we thought, how can we make this passage better for women? How can we give women power over their own lives? And instead of being objects, be actors in their own lives. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, well, you could keep on going. We're good with it. So I get that you don't call yourselves brave because you would like everybody to feel that they could step in where necessary as well. I'm going to take a risk and say, I think you're unbelievably brave. I think you guys were unbelievably brave and courageous, as is any person living who today who says, I'm scared to death, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I believe that this is so important. I'm going to step out and see what happens. And I have friends to do it with. So that was, that was there. First question. One of the things that interested me was the burgeoning feminist movement was happening at the same time, and the burgeoning clergy movement around women's rights was happening at the same time. And strange bedfellows they were. Can you talk a little bit about how you interacted with NARAL and the ERA and NOW and the clergy while this movement was happening? All three of these movements were together at the same time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm happy to. We didn't really have much to do with NARAL, the ERA. We were so busy. Plus, one thing, think of the times. These were very radical times, the late 60s and early 70s. And we came out of a political movement, out of several political movements, civil rights movement, anti-war movement, student movement. The women's liberation movement came out of what we generally refer to as the movement, the confluence of those. NARAL, was started by Larry Lader. He's not a feminist. I don't think he's alive anymore. NARAL was never a feminist organization. There's a difference between wanting to provide a service to women and wanting to change the role of women in the world. We sort of fell into the latter. The clergy was a different story. We worked we were in constant contact with the Chicago Clergy Consultation Service. And when I'm speaking, especially to young people, I always talk about what the clergy did, because the conception these days in people's mind is either you're anti-abortion, religious, moral, or you're expedient, feminist, and pro-choice. And it's not that way at all. There's just different moral systems. And the clergy's role was really invaluable because of their cloak of moral authority. They were able to publicly talk about what they were doing, but they weren't feminists, and they were all guys. Howard Moody, as much as I love him, and he would admit It wasn't coming out of he wasn't coming from a political place. He was coming from a place of rescuing women, and I think that was true for the clergy in general, of understanding the moral imperative to take action, but not from the kind of feminist political perspective we came from. And in fact, Spencer Parsons, who was the titular head of the clergy group in Chicago, said to me, we couldn't talk about the kinds of things you could talk about because we were clergy. So we did work closely with them. There were women in our group who were involved with NOW, but for the most part, most of us weren't. I think partially because many of us came from a much more radical place politically. We had already an analysis of race and class and the roles that power played around race and class in this country because of our involvement in the other branches of the movement. So that answers the question.
It does. As a matter of fact, way better than I thought. That's a much more muscular answer. I will say this. Yes, it was great. I had an abortion in 1969. In the bed next to me, it was a Catholic doctor who did it. In the bed next to me was a young woman who celebrated her scholarship by having sex for the first time and immediately getting pregnant. And she was in the bed next to me because her priest had contacted the doctor I used, both Catholic, obviously. And that's how she got her abortion, through her priest. So that's why when I read the book, I thought, wow, this is not.
Because there's a lot of nuns who are very much pro-abortion around. It's just like these days we don't hear those voices.
Right.
We only, when religious voices are mentioned or focused on, they're the stridently anti-abortion, a fetus is the same as a baby.
Right.
Garbage,
Right.
That's what we hear. And there are lots of ministers, and we know rabbis, of course, and religious leaders of all stripes who are horrified at the direction this country is taken.
Yes, good. I agree. It's good to hear that reiterated. So you guys, as every one of the feminist or women's organizations dedicated to progressing in the lives of women and children, we are all type A, and we're all annoying, and we all have our own way of doing things. We are all bright, and in the book, I saw several parts of the book that talk about high-powered group of women, a small cadre in the middle, and then everybody around those people, and trying to negotiate what that looks like when there are differences of opinion. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm going to move into how we might be able to help something like that today. So could you talk a little bit about how you negotiated peace?
Power dynamics. That's what you're asking about. And that's really key. People refer to us as the Jane Collective, and it's just like nails on a chalkboard for me, because we were about as far from a collective as you could get. I describe our organization as a series of concentric circles. So the closer you got to the center, the more you knew and the more power you had. So because knowledge is power, everyone in the group counseled. That was how you entered the group, but it was also the bedrock of what we did. It was like the most important part of what we did. So, I have to say the people in the very center in and that was primarily Jody, who I call Jenny in the book. She's long gone, and Ruth, who I refer to as Miriam, and then Martha, who I call Julia in the book, were really the center of the organization, and they made the decisions about who would be offered more responsibility, tapped to do certain jobs. That's how I wound up doing more. Was Ruth came over to my apartment and she said, "How would you like to be callback Jane?" That was the first thing other than counseling that I did. And I thought, sure, I'll do that. And that's how it went. And Sheila, who's in the film, in the book, she tells the story of she joined when I joined, and you were hooked up with a big sister, so to speak, somebody who had been there longer, and they would sit in on you would sit in on their counseling session, then they would sit in on yours, and Martha was her big sister, and so there was this power dynamic of the people who hung out at Martha's around her kitchen table, And so Sheila was down there one day and she said, "I'd like to assist." And she said there was dead silence because nobody did that. You didn't say, "I want to do this." That inner circle decided. I don't know if we'd put up with that now. As far as I was concerned back then, we had so much to do. It was fine with me that somebody else made those judgments. And generally their judgments were pretty good, of who to advance. Maybe I say that because I was advanced. So I think their judgments were good. Martha and I are still friends, and talk to each other on a fairly regular basis. So
I have a bunch of questions, but I saw a bunch of questions going in the chat. And I think time-wise, I'm going to stop talking and allow this to open up. If there is any time at the end, I have tons more questions. But let me open it up to the people who are on here and let them ask the questions they have. It doesn't have to be just me. So let's open it up, Lisa. And if we have any time left over, I have a ton of questions that I haven't asked yet.
Well, I see. Okay, I see that Dale has 2 questions. Can we let Dale ask her questions instead of me reading it, or will that take too much time?
Okay. I don't see Dale's questions.
Okay, no,
I was going to have. Go ahead, Lisa. Why don't you?
Okay, I'll read it. I'll read what she said. What are your reactions to the current situation across the country, and what would you recommend a blue state do to help?
Well, I live in a blue state too, and I'm very happy about it. So, it's the coasts here. California has a fabulous abortion fund called Access for Reproductive Justice. So I really encourage anyone to get involved with that group, because the abortion funds do what we did in the beginning. And you always start with what is needed right now today and what you can do right now today. Maybe you can't do much. Well, you start with the little bit that you can do. So, I see Jane, and I've talked to people from other countries who've done similar things. Mm-hmm. And they see Jane as kind of a model, in the sense that not that they're going to model themselves after us, but a touchstone that lets you know that this action is possible, that you could do more than you think you could do. There was a group in Argentina, 3 Catholic countries recently legalized abortion: Ireland, Mexico, and Argentina. But before Argentina did, there was a group in Argentina, women, feminists, all over the nation, who were providing counseling and abortion pills, meeting women in coffee shops and sharing their information and providing illegal abortions. And now that it's legal, I heard that they're still in business because there are women who prefer to come to them than go to a clinic. So I see us more as, we didn't have this because we evolved, but we didn't have the sense of that we had any history until at the end of our time, Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English wrote a pamphlet called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, which goes back thousands of years in the history of women as healers, as midwives, as abortionists. And it was only then that we realized we had a history. So I always hope that Jane, because times have changed and it's very different now, gives people that sense of, yes, you have a history. You come from someplace. So I don't know that I actually answered your question or whoever's question.
Okay.
Did I? If not,
yes, you did. I was also wanting to follow up with, are other organizations contacting you now for your insights into helping them? And you said you wanted to help young women or younger adults. Now, have you seen any expansion of younger people getting hold of you or talking to you about your book?
Well, there's been a lot, and through the documentary especially, because people don't really read that much anymore. So this is a real problem. Yeah, people aren't reaching out to us for advice because it's a different time, and they're going to figure it out themselves. And they're in a much better place because of the advent of medical abortions. And a much more difficult place because of the lack of privacy that people have because of the internet, which is a blessing and a curse, like so many other things are a blessing and a curse. So I don't know why they turned to a bunch of women in their 70s and 80s who were doing something in the kind of Neolithic age, comparative technologically speaking, for advice. I'm sure some of that is happening, not so much with me, but I do speak with college students and young people pretty frequently. So, I have ultimate faith in this generation of young women and men, that they are creative and smart and fearless, that they will do what needs to be done. I don't think women are going to be abandoned. My concern is all the talk of codifying Roe, which I think is a big mistake, because I think Roe was really badly decided in terms of women's rights, because Roe is all about doctors' rights. And so my hope, because I know that Dobbs is not going to stand, every red state that has a referendum on abortion, the abortion rights people win overwhelmingly, Kansas, who would have thunk, so I have faith that something else will happen. And my hope is that it's something much better than Roe, that really solidifies this as an issue about women being able to live full lives in our society. Yeah.
Somebody asked about what kind of medical training, you wrote about it in the book, but how long did it take to feel like you were competent at doing the medical procedures that you were doing? How did you get people to feel confident about it?
So I have to say, Jody was the first one to learn, and she told me, now she's gone, so we can't double check with her, but I don't think 50 years later anybody remembers anything. That Mike sort of insisted. He said, "Here, try this, see how this feels." And she was like, I'm not touching any instruments. I mean, this was such a bridge too far, you know. But he really insisted, and I think he insisted because at that point he knew, he said to me, you know, the first time I agreed to do an abortion for free, I knew the jig was up. You know, that wasn't his deal. He was there to make money. So I think he said, you know, I want to get out of this, but I wanted to go on. And the way to do that is to train people in this group. And of course, he would only train the people he was comfortable with. So that's another thing, to go back to the question about structure. You know, it was partially him because he didn't want anybody to see him. I mean, women had to wear blindfolds when he performed their abortions. So he only let a very few women in the group see him. So he partially defined that series of concentric circles and it encouraged it, and it suited the personalities of the women in the center as well, I gotta say. So let me just say that. So he had been trained by a doctor, and he I really don't know how long it took him to train Jody. For me, I'll tell you about me. Our training process was like an apprenticeship. So the first day you assist, you working as an assistant, and we had 2 women in the room with every woman who was getting an abortion, the assistant and the person doing the abortion. So the assistant got trained to do the first step, which was an IM shot. So of course, the first shot I gave, I thought I was going to kill somebody. Jody trained me how to do it, showed me how to do it. The second step is inserting a speculum. So you learn how to do that. And you do those 2 things until you feel really confident and really comfortable. Then you can go to the next step and the next step. And the next thing you know, you're inside the cervix. But it was a process of the person training you feeling comfortable with your skill and you feeling comfortable with your skill. And that apprenticeship kind of thing. So we knew a lot, but we didn't know nearly as much as we should have known, you know? And I think Martha in the film says something about that. The first time someone bled an inordinate amount, and she thought, I really don't know anything. And she was one of our most competent abortionists. We also, a lot of us, or some of us, had friends who were doctors who were willing to provide advice and suggestion. Quentin Young, and I could say this about Quentin because he's in the book and he's dead now also, who was the medical director at some point of Cook County Hospital, and also the president for a while of the American Public Health Association. He was a Hyde Park doctor. He was my doctor when I was in college, and he trained us to do pelvic exams because we realized the women we were seeing were generally poor women, because after 1970, college students and women with money and who could leave for a day. So if you were in a controlling relationship, you could have had all the money in the world and you couldn't leave for a day. Those were the women who got on planes and flew to New York and got abortions in New York and flew back. So the women we saw a lot, and it just got more and more that way, were really poor women who had no medical care. So we did pelvic exams, we did pap smears and sent them in with a friendly doctor who was one of Jody's neighbors. With his pap smears, he just put ours in with his and sent them in. So we tried to provide more in the way of medical care. And all the time showing women what we were doing, explaining what we were doing, that this is not a mystery. You know, I remember Madeline, who's gone also, so many of us, talking about when Quentin trained the group to do pelvic exams. And she's saying, oh, so you're feeling around for the ovaries and you can't feel anything, and that's a good sign. She said, you'd think he had eyes on the end of his fingertips. Some magic was going on. And so we were constantly demystifying medical practice for ourselves and for other women. We found it such a trip that we just wanted to share all this information.
Okay, so you said that you were once you got more accustomed to feeling in the body, and you felt like you were having success more than failure. So I think that makes a big difference. How were you getting along with so many of the poor women who were of color? How did you were a white group basically, right? And could you have gotten more people of
Lisa,
color involved?
Lisa, could you maybe say the name of the person who asked the questions so they know?
Okay, Myron Wallen is asking about women of color. How could they, as a community organizer, could you have, were you getting them involved?
Yeah, so we tried. And I always refer to it was a primarily white group, but it was never all white. There were always a few women of color at any particular time during the course of the group's history. And I always think about the woman I call Lois in the book. When she had her abortion, and as soon as she had her abortion, she said, "Oh, I want to do this." And so she asked one of the Jane members if she could watch the other abortions. And the Jane member said, "Well, they're these women's bodies. You have to ask them if it's okay." So she did, and she watched. And she said to herself, I want to do this. But when she told her friends what she was going to do, they said, "Are you crazy? You know, if you get arrested, those white women will walk. They'll take she had 3 children. She was 24 with 3 kids. They'll take your kids. You'll wind up in prison." So I think for a lot of the women of color, even though we said to everybody, you know, you could get up off this bed and join us. Please join us. Because we wanted there to be more women of color in the group. But for the most part, those women, for the most part, were like, no. You know, and I understand their reasons for that. It didn't deter Lois, but it deterred lots of other women, I'm sure. And, you know, if you've lived on the west side or south side of Chicago and spent your whole life there, Lois had a different experience. She was involved with the civil rights movement, and she was around a lot of white people as a result, but her friends were not. And sorry about that. And so weren't at all comfortable in that kind of situation. So it was a sticking point for us, and it was a problem, and we recognized it as a problem, but we did as much as we could about it, but were not that successful in making it a much more multiracial group.
Well, at least your book explains how many women of color came to you anyway.
Oh, when you're desperate, you know, that's the thing I say. Well, they trusted us. Well, they were desperate and they were terrified. You know, and we were kind of hippie radicals. I mean, this was not their world. Coming to my apartment was not at all a comfortable, in a different part of the city they weren't used to. But what are you going to do? I mean, that's what it was. And I think we did our best to build trust and to make women comfortable. But the bottom line is these women were desperate. And thank God they came to us instead of what their other options might have been. But you can't downplay the level of desperation and fear, you know, at all. We did our best, but, and I hope that lots of women left feeling more comfortable. And I did get to find a few of those women that I interviewed for the book, who talked about what an amazing experience it was for them. You know, this one woman said, all these people, were risking their lives. For me, I must be a pretty important person. I mean, that's exactly what you want people to think. Or the woman who said to her counselor, if they're lying to us about this, meaning abortion, what else are they lying to us about? We wanted to shake people up, so we took a bit of pride once we had taken over in telling the people we counseled that it wasn't a doctor doing the abortion. And as Martha says, well, if that didn't do a number on their heads, then we'd have to find another way to do a number on their heads, because the whole point was to get people to look at the world in a way they hadn't looked at it before. And that was true for poor Black women from the South Side of Chicago, as well as college students from Evanston. This is what we were really about. The abortion was part of it, but for us, it was not the major part of it. The major part of it was educating and awakening a sense of self in as many women as we could, a sense that they were actors and not passive. This happened to me. No, now you take charge. And in fact, Sherry, who's also no longer with us, I'm laughing only because we're old. And so this is happening. Sherry was teaching at a progressive Catholic high school, and she talks about the students that she saw, the ones who chose abortion, the ones who got pregnant, of that group, the ones who chose abortion, what different lives they had than the ones who didn't. And she was their conduit to Jane. So that's how she found Jane for one of her students, and then she started counseling.
How did you hear about other cities having similar projects while you were doing it?
There were no similar projects, not to the extent that we did. There were everywhere women's liberation groups doing abortion counseling and referral and raising money. But I don't know whether it's something in the water in Chicago, which has a vast radical past, or just the kismet of the dynamic between Mike and Jody, for instance, and the particular women who were drawn to this, why we evolved the way we evolved. As far as I know, no other group in other cities did what we did, at least not to the extent we did that.
Wow. Did Stella Unger is asking, how did you get the drugs and the equipment?
Oh, this is interesting. Jody she didn't remember how she made contact with a friendly pharmacist in South Shore. And he was willing, we would have to soak the labels off the bottles. She would drive to his pharmacy and drive around to the back and load up her car with drugs from him that we paid for. Equipment, it turns out, this is a good lesson for anybody who wants to do something slightly illegal. If you wear a white coat and you have cash and you know what to ask for, and you go into a medical supply house, they will sell you anything.
Wow.
I mean, we're buying curettes. There's only one thing you do with curettes, which is D&C abortions. And they're selling it to us because we have our little lab coats on, we have cash, and we know the language, how to ask for things. So that was, that's how we handled that. And it served us in good stead when we opened Women's Health Clinic after Jane folded. And then we were fitting diaphragms. And I remember Diane, who you see in the documentary, she's the one who tells the cops they're roasting pig because they're roasting pork for lunch that day. And he says, "What are you cooking?" And she says, "Pig." Mouthy little girl that she is. But anyway, what was the point of this? Oh, Diane used to call up the pharmacy to order like diaphragms or Monistat, which was prescription only. I mean, all this stuff, so much that's over the counter, including pregnancy tests. You had to go to a physician to get a pregnancy test. But she would call up and she'd say, "This is Juanita from Dr. Jones' office. And I want to, you just have to sound like you know what you're talking about. And you get by with a lot. But the friendly pharmacist, that was a good connection. I don't know if he came through Mike or came through one of Jody's other connections. She had a lot of connections, She was on the board of the Chicago Civil Liberties Union, trying to convince them to do stuff on women's issues, and they didn't think it was important at that point. What changed all these years have made, even with the ACLU. We wouldn't have had RBG, with that kind of attitude.
Okay, in the book, you collect a lot of statistics. Something like 11,000 abortions. Is that the number? Natalie Swit is asking, did you keep statistics, age, time of abortion, economic background? You had your little cards. That's what I remember.
We had our little cards, and that was it. We couldn't keep records because we were illegal. And if we'd gotten busted, then we would have had records. And we weren't that together to start keeping documents. There was a point in our last maybe 6 months where Ruth and Martha reached out to a gynecologist in Chicago, and he agreed because we knew we were doing great, but we wanted to prove it. And he agreed to do post-abortion checkups and provide birth control. And if women wanted it, sterilization as well, with us present, and we paid for it. And he was charging us $10 a person. So this was not, it was not a big shell out. He wasn't there to make money, so that they could keep sort of an eye on how well did we really do. And from there, so we'd offer that to every woman. You want a free post-abortion check with the gynecologist. We've got a thing set up on Saturdays. You can come on this Saturday. And we would make appointments, and then a couple of us would be there with the gynecologist while he was examining. He let us be in the room. So we found out that we indeed were right. We were doing a great job. The 11,000 plus is an estimate that Jody gave me, and it's the one we go with. I don't know if it's true. I know that in our later days, we were doing 30 abortions a day, 3 days a week. So, and we just worked 3 days a week. And we had 2 women doing the abortions and 2 assistants. That was the setup at the place, which is what we called the apartment. We'd either borrowed or was one of our apartments. You can imagine saying to friends, do you mind if we use your apartment for a day to do illegal abortions? But some people actually said yes. We used Marie's apartment a lot. Marie's in the film. You see her in the Black woman in the film. Because I remember cleaning Marie's apartment because we were a bunch of kids. So the first thing we do is we walk into somebody's apartment. We'd have to clean it from top to bottom because it was like, I remember Diane saying people hadn't dusted their spice racks in years, So, and we brought our own sheets and towels, and we brought the equipment. But sometimes people would come home and towels would be missing, or an article of clothing. If somebody, because we would have women remove their clothes from the waist down. So if somebody got blood on their shirt, we would just go into whoever's closet was and find a shirt for them. We weren't that, I guess, respectful is the word. I don't know. Our job was to take care of the women who came through the service. So that was our priority. We weren't that careful. And we borrowed cars and, from people. So because we had a place set up that was we called the front because it was a front. That was the address women were given, again, with the creative names. And so women would come there and we encourage them to bring somebody with them. So they would bring friends or mothers or husbands or sisters, and they oftentimes brought their kids because they didn't have childcare. So there would be kids running around, and then the guys would be playing cards or watching sports on TV. We had all this food. It was like quite a scene. And we would counsel the out-of-town women then because we couldn't see them in person before then. You know, we weren't going to ask them to come into Chicago twice. So they'd come to the front, and whoever was working the front would take them aside and do the counseling, which included a lot of birth control information, a lot of women's health information, and always included not only what an abortion was, but everything you would see, feel, experience that day, because we knew that what terrified people was not knowing. And so, unlike when you have a medical procedure now, they never explain anything. They take you down the hall, you don't know where you're going. Sometimes the doctor or nurse are having a conversation over your head, like you're just don't really exist. We were the opposite of that because we knew how horrible that felt. So the woman was the center of the event, and we wanted her to, so nothing would be a surprise, you know.
And I wanted to know if it's still true. I think I saw it in the epilogue of the 2022 Kindle edition. 80% of counties in the US have no abortion service. Is that still true?
I think it's more than that now. I mean, that I wrote in 1996. So when I didn't.
Okay, so it was the early, okay.
Yeah, that was already true in 96. That's what I mean. You know, people think, oh, Roe. You know, for women in Montana 2 years ago, or South Dakota, Roe could not even exist. It wouldn't make any difference in their lives. They had no access. So as long as we allowed that to happen, and especially for the most vulnerable, young people, poor people, and people of color, then, you know, and that started with the Hyde Amendment, which was just a couple of years after Roe, you know, and that was a travesty because pre-Roe, the one thing all women, regardless of their backgrounds, had in common was they couldn't access abortion. And once the Hyde Amendment was passed, it was really a wedge separating women. And the women with money and power were the women who could get abortions. You know, so I always try to think of what the least of us is experiencing and try to put myself in that place. And, you know, with the poor women we saw, whether they were white or Black or Latinx, we didn't change our rap in any way. We gave them the same information because they needed to know it too. I mean, we were all, because of our biology, in the same situation, you know. That was the thread that ran through.
Okay, Laura, what I'd like to know, and some of the other people have asked, what did you do when you grew up?
What did I do when I grew up? Well, that grew me up. Let me tell you, that really changed my life. Eileen and I were just talking after we did this indivisible mass thing yesterday afternoon. And we said to each other, you know, being in Jane changed our lives completely. I had not seen myself as a competent person. And I learned that I was a competent person. I could take responsibility for other people's lives and handle that responsibility competently. And that was, you know, I also learned that if something needs to be done, I could figure it out. You know, I did some car mechanics and, you know, I can figure things out. I stop, I don't panic. Something breaks in the house. First thing I do is see if there's a way that I can figure out what's wrong and perhaps fix it myself. And sometimes I can, but it's that sense that you can figure things out, that you're a person who can do that rather than always turning to somebody else.
And
So,
what did you go into as a job?
well, I've been a community organizer. So we started a clinic for a well women's clinic in Chicago called the Emma Goldman Women's Health Center. And then I moved to rural Wisconsin and got hooked up with a doc who had just moved there from Bellingham, Washington, where he'd been attending home births with a group of midwives. So I did that with a bunch of nurses. I was the only non-credentialed one of the midwives. So I was really a lay midwife. They were too, because they weren't officially trained. And then with a group of women in rural Wisconsin, we started a shelter-based program for battered women. So I did that. And I was the first director. It was pretty funny. I thought, oh, the state of Wisconsin is giving me thousands of dollars. And, a year and a half ago, I was a criminal. So I did that. And then I moved back east and worked with nursing home residents. And then I worked on health insurance, especially issues around managed care and consumer rights in managed care. And now I'm retired. And now I'm doing stuff. I've been doing stuff on immigrant rights. My neighbor and friend Linda and I set up a group when Trump got elected. We were both not sleeping. And, the one thing I've learned is if you're not sleeping and you're sick to your stomach, the only way out of it is to do something. So I said to Linda, I'm thinking we need to do something on immigration because that's what's floated to the surface, to the top of the heap of shit, if you pardon my French, that administration was dumping on us. And so I've learned an incredible amount, and we set up a group in Woodstock, and that's still ongoing. I'm still working with a statewide coalition. So you don't get to just bake cupcakes and play in the garden. I mean, I'd like to, use that as an excuse. So, like I said, I've been an organizer most of my professional life.
Well, it's a real treat to have you with us, telling us about organization, and we try to organize a lot with NCJW. I think anywhere in the United States, you might look for NCJW and you could find some partners. One of the things that we just recently did nationally is we've raised $1 million for Jews for abortion rights.
Great.
And we'll keep on raising and moving legislation. We're really into working on legislation and advocating in our local communities in any way that we can.
Access for Reproductive Justice, they provide transportation. They do a lot more than just raise money. They have places where women who are coming into California can stay. That's really important. So there's lots of ways members of your group could assist, and that's a statewide group. And the original, I don't know if they were the original, but this is when the book first came out. I met the two staff people who are based in Oakland, and they got the connection because they had two computers. They named one Big Jane and one Little Jane. So they understood the legacy and the lineage that we shared. So I really encourage you all to get involved, and even if you can just send Access money. I send Access in California money. I did a fundraiser for them many, many years ago, but I send them money every year. So, and I don't even live in California.
Well, folks, I'm going to pass it back, Lisa, to you or to Deb, whoever wants to wrap it up. But action, I promised action and mystery. We got all of it, including some good ideas moving forward with how we are going to move forward with our reproductive rights coalitions. Lisa, are you wrapping or is
Yes, we have a slide that we're going to show you next. And thank you, Laura. We're going
Thank
to have
you.
a slide showing you upcoming programs and one of our newest programs. So we've, for many years, we've worked with kindergarten festivals, bringing information to new parents. And we ask for morning people from 8 a.m. to noon to be registering and helping out with the materials on February 4th and 25th. On February 17th and 18th, we're going to be working with several synagogues for a national project that's called Repro Shabbat, and working with rabbis for reproductive rights too. And there'll be programs geared towards how can we make life better for women in general due to this effort. February 28th is our newest activity. We're going to be gathered together, I believe, at the Elpert Jewish Community Center, putting together abortion kits that are care kits, packets that we will give to women coming from out of California into California, working with Planned Parenthood, and we'll have a Planned Parenthood speaker speaking about the initiatives that are going on. It's one of our first in-person events. We've been doing a lot on Zoom, but this one will be women working together for helping women. So abortion aftercare kits, assembly, and guest speaker. So I hope you all will look at our e-blasts that come out on Friday afternoon, Friday afternoons usually. And we have special e-blasts on email that try to reach everybody, and we'll be sending a postcard out probably about these same events. So I look forward to seeing some people in person and for future Zoom events. And thank you very much for attending.